This is a shot of our ranch. I'll kind of give you a little history. This is Lake Oahe here in the Missouri River. This is the Missouri River cut banks, about a 200 to 300 foot cut bank, some very tough soils off of that. And basically there's two small farms. My farmstead is right here is the farmstead. That was my father's farm, and my grandfather's farm, abandoned farms, are down here. It's two small farms put together. Then I acquired a quarter down here and 360 acres over here. So there's a total of about 2,000 acres. I own 1,700, plus I lease some river bottom land there for grazing. So my topic today, again, a little history. Like I said, my wife and we raised 5 children, and basically this was a small grain farm, and we raised some livestock, cow, calf, pairs, and right now we're switching it over from turning all my cropland back into grass. And I run a custom herd of about 125 head plus a herd of my own. So the custom herd runs out on the Sierra range and my irrigated pasture, and the river bottoms are on my cattle on there. So it's a very intensive grazing system. Basically we had, that was before and this is an after. Right now we're running right at 38 paddocks, averaging about 40 acres each. And our goal is to break those down. This year we're going to split again, get down to 20 acres. This year when I acquired this, I split this up into 20s. I could see quite a difference. Again, it's the high stock density, short time in each paddock. They're probably only in each paddock maybe about maybe 6 days total for the season. We're getting to it's pretty much a once over. Some of the cool season paddocks, stuff that was seeded back, those will graze twice, but the majority is going to be grazed once. We found out when you let those plants get totally mature, plus when you get into the grazing system, the nutrient level just seems to get better and better. So we can be grazing, again, during the growing season, we probably only graze it 6 days total probably in each paddock. And then we stockpile grass, then we graze in the winter. So we'll graze as long as we can until the snow gets too deep, and then we'll bale graze. So I'll go through kind of how I got involved with growing cover crops. We first started growing cover crops after a crop. Then we started growing cover crops as the main crop, and then growing cover crops on poor land that was seeded back to grass, and we were trying to rejuvenate that land and then seed it back to a diverse mixture of grasses and legumes. Because again, when we seeded it back to grass 20 some years ago, we didn't fix the problem. Still had a restricted layers, that are tillage layers there, a lot of compaction and very, very low vigor in the plants. So we had very little nutrients in those in that system. So here, by planting cover crops several years, I can build up my nutrients, break up a lot of those tillage layers, get my soil organisms in balance, just like Gabe and Jill were saying, you know, how important the soil organisms are. There's more living things than a handful of soil than a few on this earth. So we've got to start thinking that way. What's underground? Our livestock underground, to me, are more important than the livestock above ground. So we have to manage for them. And the only way you can give them a home, make sure you feed them a diverse diet, and that's where our cover crops come in with very diverse diet. And get all different types of roots and all different types of plants in there. So that's what we've been doing on our cropland, setting it up to seed it back to grass. A lot of this work I learned through the soil district. Again, I work full-time for the soil conservation district, and that's where we experiment with cover crops. And I tried them there with work we were doing on very good soils, and doing it here on some very, very tough soils. Most of this off this cut banks, it's from a pure sand to a heavy clay or gumbo to a clay pan. So, and plus all the bentonite that wash off those cut banks. So it's a very tough soils, and it's in the field. Yeah, so you can have from pure sand to a gumbo to a sandy loam in there. So a lot of variances. This was that 360 acres that I acquired about 10 years ago, This one was kind of a unique situation too. Here I've got a live stream running through. That's the only water source. And you had about 10 miles of drainage this way and about 4 that way. So when you get a hard rain upstream, that's a rushing river, and otherwise there's beaver dams in there, so you always have water there. But when I put the cattle in there, the big pasture like that, they weren't satisfied. Within a week, they were in there. There's all kinds of grass. My cousin lives down here, and he'd drive by there every day, and the cattle would follow and bellowing like they were starved. Again, he changed the cattle's behavior, so I fixed them. I made a bunch of little pasture, and then they were happy. So that's just how an animal's behavior changes. People say, well, you're moving cattle so often. And what a chore. Well, it's just a joy. The cattle get so used to being moved. You just call them or open the gate, they'll move. So again, the challenge here was this is a riparian area. So when I move the cattle in, I'll put the herd in there. We just split that riparian once, so that's one paddock. So we bring them in here, leave them in there maybe 3 days, pick out a paddock here. They'll pick a water point and go right back to that. Next time you move them over here, they pick a water point there. So they just go back and forth. But if you left them in there just a day too long, and you got some regrowth, they'll start grazing there. So you got to really watch that. But the changes I could see here with these smaller paddocks, I mean, the amount of production there, we easily have doubled our stocking rate. And I always say I got more grass now at the end of the year than I used to grow for the full season. Again, we're stockpiling. So with again, our calving date was changed from February, March till end of May and June. If you calve with Mother Nature, things get so much simpler. You can run those cattle through the winter. We don't wean the calves till March, so the calves run the cows over the winter. And but their nutrient level and a lot of this native grass still meets the needs of a lactating cow, so I don't have to supplement when I'm out on the native range. And then again, when the snow gets too deep, then I'll start bale grazing. So whatever Mother Nature throws at you, you got to be planning ahead. So anyway, that's our grazing system. Very high stock density. Right now, we've got 38 paddocks. This here pasture here used to look like this carpet when it was season long, and that's how you can change it. The big blue stem moving up out of the draws. There's say big blue stem. There's western wheat. There's green needle that's moving up out of those draws. So it's so you can imagine the amount of production there compared to in the past. And on our pivot, again, this system I run with my cows. I run the yearlings and the cows run on the pivot and then down the river bottoms. When I first put this system in, our rotation in the past was half the pivot, this 128 acre pivot, one half would be alfalfa and the other half would be corn. I would leave that in 4 to 5 years, just flip flop. Well, that was no rotation. I was adding more inputs. So then I figured, well, I could, when I was using cover crops on the other, well, why not try and see what I could build this up first with cover crops and then seed it back to grass. So then when we grazed this, again, the first time I just built this as 8 pastures in a wagon wheel style, that didn't work. So again, you got to have failures. So I just tore it out, started over, and then I put in more water points. So each one has four paddocks off each water point, and then this one still has the 2. And then plus this here, I'll strip that. These are 7 acre paddocks, and I'll run anywhere from, it doesn't matter the numbers, I can run anywhere from 40 to 150 head in there. Again, I strip that with a hot take across. There I'll move probably every day then. But again, you can create a tremendous amount of production. We kept track of the grazing days in there. On the north half, 2 years ago, I had 111 grazing days per acre. Again, that's no inputs. So again, you could have planted corn back then. The $7 corn, I probably would have made a lot more money. It was really crazy to plant it to grass. Well, I said keep planting corn in there, all the inputs, and you just keep adding and adding. This here is regenerating it in the long run. With no inputs, you can make a profitable living that way. Again, the irrigated paddock would be 18, average 7 acres. And when we graze that, again, we basically just clip it and move on to the next paddock, and it recovers very quickly. Now I'll get into, when we started with cover crops. That was in 2006. We planted winter triticale, and these 3 paddocks here, well, it's 3 fields. This was 4 acres, and this was a 9-acre one, and this is a 9-acre field. So I had planted winter triticale the year in the fall, and then in the spring we started grazing it. What I want to show in this photo is I was standing on top of the cut bank. You can see all the pretty good soils here, the bentonite and stuff washing off of that, and that runs through your fields. So until we put a diversion and converted a lot of that runoff around it. But again, we seeded that to winter triticale. We started grazing that. That year it was quite an early spring. A lot of years in May, we got very little growth, but that year it was an early year. So then you just, whatever Mother Nature throws at you, that's what you go by. So here we started grazing May 9th with 60 head in there. We're in there about 2 days on the 4 acres, and that's what it looked like when we pulled them out. I probably grazed that down a little too far. Moved them to the next pasture. You can see how much that triticale has grown already. There's May 16th. You can just see that stuff grows 3-4 inches a day. So we grazed those 3 pastures, 22 acres, then headed down. That's about what we had left on the last one there. Now I left a lot more residue. I had to get down to the pivot. So that's what I left. We went down to the pivot, started grazing. There was a mixture of, it probably was about 4 or 5 grasses and about 3 legumes in there. It was pretty much all cool season. What we seeded the rest of the pivot, the other half, now we're always planting a mixture of warm and cool season grasses with like 4 or 5 legumes with it. Again, I just want to throw everything out there and let Mother Nature, whether it fits. Some years, some grass are better than others, so I'm not smart enough to figure out, so I let Mother Nature do it. So I'll just throw everything out there, whatever grows, grows. Anyway, we grazed that. Again, very high stock densities out there. That was a month later, that first field, and my granddaughter stood in there. She was about 3 years old. The stuff was hitting out already. That's how fast that triticale will grow. So then I didn't have enough animals on the first go around, so I added some more. Now I run 135 pairs through there. And again, we run through that, and that's what we had left. After we grazed it again, we want to leave quite a bit of residue there. Went back to the pivot, grazed that again. July we came back and grazed that triticale again, and then we planted cover crop mixture. It's really crazy. It was probably in the mid-90s, but what I wanted to show there, how important the ground has to be totally covered. If I would have did any tillage on there, well, you would open that ground up. Your soil temperature is very high. There's no way that would have grown. So we seeded that August 2nd. This was probably taken a week later. Stuff was starting to come through. Actually, the neighbor that planted it for me, I had enough for about 40 acres. He seeded those 22 acres. He said, "This is crazy." And he took his drill and went home. So, but then a month or so later, early September, there was a tremendous amount of forage out there. Now the radish and the turnips are really taking off. That was the end of September. Again, we probably had maybe an inch of moisture in that amount of time. So but if your ground is totally covered, you created a home for the soil life, for the soil biology, and again, very, very much a diversity in the mix. So we started grazing that at the end of October and into November, and that's what, again, it's very high nutrition, actually too high, probably in the 20s as far as protein. So we just basically balanced our diet. We put straw out where the water point was, set a wagon out there with straw bales, and they balanced their diet with the straw. Again, when I graze it, I probably leave at least half of it there. That's so important. Again, the livestock below ground, they need to be fed too. They're more important than the critters above ground. But then late November, now your brassicas, they're still growing. In the cowpea and soybeans, they pretty much dried up. Someone asked me the other meeting, why are there these strips in here? I didn't have GPS on my drill. It's hard to see into that stubble because you can't see where you're at. So it's a check strip. But anyway, your turnips and radishes keep right growing in November. So we then we grazed that again in December for a short while. So I just put what my costs were, what it cost me to grow that. This was the cost for the winter triticale, $14 for seed, custom seeding, the guy charged me $10. I did do a chemical burn down, put a starter fertilizer on the triticale, and then in the spring, I broadcasted about 100 pounds of urea. That's what the fertilizer cost me then. Now when I do it, I don't put any fertilizer on. I add, again, more diversity. Instead of planting monoculture, I'll put winter triticale, hairy vetch, turnip, and radish, and probably throw some clover in there. So anyway, I had $98 expense growing the triticale. My cover crop back then cost me about $20 an acre. That same mix today is probably about $40. Again, $10 for seeding. And then I did a chemical burn down. Now I normally don't even need a burn down anymore. If that field has got good cover, and you don't need a chemical burn down on there. But anyway, that's what it cost me for 2 crops, $138 an acre. And that's what I got off of it, grazing. Grazed the winter triticale 3 times. I kept track of the grazing days. Again, I grazed it late in May, June, again in July. Then I grazed the cover crop. I got 1,222 grazing days. I grazed that late October into November, and then again in December. So it's 3,820 grazing days, and I figured quite conservative, a 2 pound a day gain on those calves. We did some other studies, we were getting over 3 pounds a day gain. So you figure 7,640 pounds of beef, I figured $1 a pound then. So that still is 347 gross. Take away your expense, that's $209 an acre profit. Again, you got very little machinery cost. You got just the seeding and the spraying, and let the livestock do the work for you. Well, then I wanted to see what response I had after growing the cover crop. So the next year, this was the fields in 2007 that had the triticale and we grazed it, and then the cover crop. This field to the north, I compared it. This one was actually both these fields were oats, turnip, and ryegrass in 2006. In 2006 was an extremely dry year, so we grazed that then. And then, like I say, in the fall, I planted winter triticale on this one, and this one I just left idle. So then in 2007, this had barley, and then 2007, again, this was the triticale and the cover crop. So in 2008, we seeded barley in here again. Full fertility, and on this side we just shut the fertilizer off and put no fertilizer on at all. But that's what it looked like April 18th when we went to seed it. Again, after we grazed this cover crop in November, December, that's how much cover we had left. So to me, that's so important. The ground has to be totally covered. And that was probably our driest winter. There was no snow that winter at all. I think it was the driest 3 months on record for Bismarck. So I was very skeptical. It was difficult to plant a crop into that. I took my moisture probe. I had all to do to get it through the top 3 inches, and then it went down probably another 3-4 inches and hit rock bottom again. So basically I was seeding into no moisture. And we did, about a week later, we did get about a ½ inch of rain. Stuff got up and going, and it didn't know whether it should live or die. But come June, we got some very timely rains. This photo on that side was the field on the north side of the driveway, which you'd be right on the other side of the trees. And you could see something happening already. This was way darker green, had no fertilizer, but that's the one that had the cattle and the cover crops, and this one had full fertility. We harvested that very early at high moisture because I wanted to get the grain off there so I could plant a cover crop again. But now I was sold on cover crops, so I'm going to plant a cover crop whenever I can. So we took that off, and this is what those fields yielded. The north field with no cover crops yielded right at 65 bushel. That had a full fertility program. Cost me about $44 an acre then for fertilizer. Now that probably would be quite almost double that. The other with no fertilizer yielded right at 85 bushel. So I figured $5 a bushel then for barley. That was $144 an acre difference. That was my response for my cover crops. People say, well, that's extremely high. But those fields that where I had the south field, we used to feed cattle on there probably about 20 years ago. We fed cattle on there for about 10 years. So there probably was a lot of deep nutrients that were never used, so with those deep-rooted plants, they probably pulled up a lot of those nutrients. So we got a tremendous crop response. Well then, figured, well, I better seed a cover crop right away as soon as we got it off. Again, what I wanted to show there, how important the cover is. I want the soil totally covered when I seed into it. So it probably was in the mid-90s. Ground was powder dry. But it's amazing how little bit of moisture it takes to get that cover crop up and going. You got that mat of litter on the surface, you get just a little bit of rain, the cover crop is up and going. By October, we had some volunteer barley in there. Again, we grazed it that fall. So then the next year I thought, well, why not seed it back to corn? But what I want to show here is the amount of residue we had left. This photo was taken in July. We seeded the corn in May 23rd. But I cut my fertility back. We didn't add any nitrogen to the corn. It was just a starter. Down the tube, we put down a blend of probably 24, 8, 24, 16, 8, something like that down to, so I put about 100 pounds down the tube. That's what it looked like in August. That yielded 113 bushels. Again, cutting your inputs. So, I mean, that's, in my county, in Morton County, you can't even insure corn for grain because you'll never make it, so prove them wrong, I guess. So then the next year I thought on that field, well, why not experiment, plant a full season cover crop just to see the response there. So this was a cool season mix I put in. I planted some barley, field pea, again a very diverse mix. I wanted a certain amount of legumes in there, and then some deep tap roots, the turnip and radish, and I threw sunflowers in. That was the wrong time of the year to put sunflowers in. They don't like it when it's cool. And now, usually when I seed early, I won't throw the radish in either, because normally they'll bolt and set seed up our way when it's very early like that. So then I'll just add a little more turnip in there. And that's what it looked like. Again, it was seeded April 21st. What I wanted to show there was no-till into corn residue, and that's up and going. So we hayed that in July. And when I hay it, I want to set my shoes as high as possible. So then you just clip over the top of these turnips. Like the hairy vetch was blossoming right with the barley. Again, we got about 4,800 pounds an acre. And that's what it looked like a month later. That was a pretty wet year. The vetch is blossoming again, and now the turnips, late August, they really take off. So then we started grazing that in December. The week after I turned them into that, we had probably a two foot of snow. That winter we had right at 100 inches of snow, so that cut my grazing down. But when it got too deep, we just moved the cattle out, and then we started bale grazing. But the wildlife moved into there, the deer camped on there all winter, and the pheasants followed them. So it makes excellent wildlife feed. If you want wildlife close to your yard, plant your cover crops by the yard. If you don't want them there, plant them as far away from your yard as you can, and they'll go to the neighbors. But they will find a cover crop because it's so high in nutrients. No matter how deep the snow is, they'll pick those fields. So then I could see what I was doing on what the cover crops are doing for me on my better ground and on the grain fields. I thought, well, why not try to rejuvenate some of this pasture land? This was one of my paddocks off the 25-acre field that was seeded back to grass probably in the mid-60s, but it never really produced much. Again, very tough soils off these cut banks. You had clay pan strips through there. A lot of bentonite had washed across those fields. Anytime you get a hard rain, there is a diversion on this other side. We divert everything to one point, but if you get an inch or 2 inch rain, it'll usually just flood right across them and spread across the field. And the bentonite will just seal everything up. So I thought, well, why not try and rejuvenate some of this land with cover crops? And so I took, we grazed it fairly early, probably in the first part of May, and then let it regrow a little bit, and then I sprayed it out and planted a warm season mix into that. Again, it was very rough, probably went about 3 miles an hour, Then I had a guidance system on my tractor, so you get a little board sitting there. But that's one way I will not tell anything, so I didn't want to disturb it. So I did. That was probably about 15 years ago. I was at some irrigated ground. We put a pivot in, and it was very rough because we farmed it this way, and now I'm going to farm it lengthways. And I had to go out there and disc it. And be darned if Gabe didn't happen to drive by and catch me. So, so I can't disc anymore. So anyway, I seeded this into a warm season mix. Again, I wanted very high diversity. Again, and legumes in there, the cowpea and the soybeans and the sweet clover. They're my legumes in there. I put pearl millet and Sudan. I like those two. The pearl millet, again, very high structure, and it can withstand the snow, so I can graze these quite late. Again, I like the sunflower in there. The turnip and radish, they'll come on later in the season. And now this same mix, I'll usually add probably some Italian ryegrass. I had a little corn left over, so I just threw that in. Normally corn doesn't do very well in a warm season mix for us. So that's what we did in 2006, or yeah, it was 2008. Well, anyway, then this is what it looked like in August. This is the diversion right beside, that's the diversion in here, that's the corn on the other side. But anyway, this is the cover crop. That's what it looked like in September. It was quite dry already by then. It was amazing what the amount of roots we had there. There's your radish. They'll get massive, probably 2-3 inches in diameter across, and go down good 12 to 16 inches of massive root in a small taproot. Again, diversity in there. There's clovers in there. Again, the ground is totally covered. Here's your cowpea and soybeans in there. So then we graze that, usually November, December, January, whenever you want to. And these were fall calvers. So then the next spring, this was taken June 2nd. What is very different, 1 year of cover crops, I tried to spray the grass out. The next spring, the brome grass came back way healthier than it was before. Before it would never even head out. Now it's heading out by the 2nd of June. And the sweet clover we had put in that mix, that was about waist high already. But what was very interesting, the whole field was solid dandelions. They weren't there before, so another deep taproot. So I changed something there and created a flush of dandelions. They weren't there the next year, so I don't know what's going on, but things. So we did it again. We turned around and grazed that in June, and then planted a warm season cover crop.
Did you spray it again, or did you just?
Yeah, I sprayed it again. Back then I was using Roundup, and again I won't use Roundup anymore, but that's another story. But anyway, we burned it down, planted a cover crop, and the grass never ever came back again. So, but the second year, the cover crop was it was just so much healthier looking. First year we put a little bit of fertilizer down. We probably put down the tube about 50 pounds at the start. And then after that, we never fertilized it anymore. But what was interesting the second year, the cowpea and the soybeans were just full inodulation. The first year we didn't see that, although we had inoculated them. But everything just looked so much healthier. Again, we grazed that in December. Cattle look pretty content out there. But I wanted to show there the amount of residue we would leave. I could have left them out there probably another 4 or 5 days or more, but it was so important. I want to leave that residue. That's the feeding. Again, the feeding, overemphasizing that we're trying to feed the soil biology. So we'll always try and leave as much residue as possible. So I turned around and did it again. I just experimented in this field. I've done this now. This will be we seeded cover crop 5 years in a row. But basically what I'm doing, I'm setting it up to seed it back to my grass mixture. 2011 was a little different year when we planted it. We had about a 3-inch rain and in a hailstorm. Stuff was up. It basically took out the brassicas and a lot of the cowpea and soybeans. So we had a stand of millet and Sudan, but a lot of pigeon grass came with that tremendous hard rain. It planted the pigeon grass. So I figured, well, why not utilize that pigeon grass too? So we grazed that very early that year. Strip grazed it. I'd give them about 90 feet. That's roughly how far a fence posts are apart, so I just run a strip across with a hot tape, drive through with the four-wheeler, make a path, unreel my wire and walk back and put the posts in. The cattle would come to that little bit of an opening and see that. So I was moving through that field there. That's what it looked like. It's probably the end of August. Again, you can see how tall that stuff was. It probably got about 7 or 8 feet tall. And so we grazed that for 44 days and grazing days in July and August, and then again we grazed it in November. And we got another 19 grazing days. So we've got 63 grazing days per almost 25 acres. But again, I was feeding the soil biology a little different diet, because basically it was grazing that was a little lower carbon, and again it was very high carbon. Again, just getting more diversity in the feed stuff for the soil. Then in 2012, that was an extremely dry year. The cover crops still did fantastic. On this field, this was one right on top of the hill where we're doing the same thing. And I did 10 acres of corn on each side of it was a 54 acre field. I did 10 acres of corn on each side just to see what crop response we'd have on that. That corn yielded 81 bushels. The stuff right beside it, the neighbors right across the fence. Most of our corn in our area was just chopped for silage that year. It never made grain. So it's amazing when you start building your soils, how resilient your plants are, and they can withstand this drought period. So it makes quite a difference growing and building your soils with the cover, but that gets pretty exciting. Well, then I wanted to compare bale grazing to where I was doing the cover crops. So right now we're bale grazing on, this was a 10 acre field. And that year I hated it and just left the bales out there, and then I brought in these other bales. So we set it up. This was supposed to be a 100-day supply. Then I had 60 cow-calf pairs of my own. And so when we set that up, I'd basically just run a hot tape across and give them about 6 days at a time. Again, that winter was, that was 2 winters in a row. We had roughly 100 inches of snow, so it was a little challenge out there. You had a lot of snow, so I tried just giving them 6 days. Then I got lazy and I gave them 2 rows. You can see we used a cable, and I pushed the snow between the rows and set up my fence. So basically we just used these plastic posts or fiberglass posts with steel cable and energize that. The calves could actually go under it, and they'd always have good hay. Because when we set up our bales, I'll put out probably a third of it will be good hay, and then about a third of it will be very poor hay, and then other average quality hay in there. So it depends on how much carbon I want to leave. The poor hay, they'll lay on that and dung and urinate on it. And again, if my goal is to cover the ground, I'll put poor hay out there, and if I wanted to clean it up, I'll put better hay out there. So just you can manage what you want to, what your results are going to be. So I gave them 12 days of grazing, then I'd move it. My granddaughter would go out there and help me. She done stuff that was fun. But again, I wanted to show there how deep the snow was. That wire was about this high. So again, took some fuel to push the snow. And of course you had fun running around the bales while putting up the... 2011 was another real tough winter. Well, then I just said, I got lazier yet. I didn't even take the tractor up there. I just walked up and I just set my posts up in the snow. It was harder, crusted snow. I just set my fences across that way. That worked out just fine. And then after I got done bale grazing, that field was right up here. That was about 10 acres. Now I'm bale grazing 2 miles from the yard. People say you're crazy. There's some deep ravines. What happens? You got a storm. You get the cattle back home. So I did put up. We do have a deep pipeline there, so I put in an energy-free tank down there and shelter. So that's what we're bale grazing right now. Again, we'll start bale grazing whenever Mother Nature makes us, I guess. Because normally we have enough stockpiled grass now. My goal is basically to run these cattle 365 days out of the year without feeding hay. We probably have to supplement a little bit, especially if we got to leave the calves on the cows that long. But one thing, by leaving the calves and the cows over the winter, those calves learn how to graze, and the mother teaches them quite a bit. So if you keep those heifers back, they'll get adapted to your environment, whatever you throw at them, and they're going to do just fine. So that was in 2012. That was a real open winter. So again, I only fed for, I think, about 75 days that winter. Those two tough winters before. One winter was 112 days, and I think the other was 118. Then last year it was very cool in the spring, March and April, because the grasses never came. So I fed, I think, about 128 days. So it was that was full feed. That was January 5th. By the 15th, I had the bale set up on these other paddocks, so I started bale grazing again with very little snow. That's my portable shelter, and there's a fountain right in there. That was in 2012. 2013, we got kind of back to normal. That was, I could say, 2012. It was quite dry that fall, so we didn't have as much stockpile grass, but we made it till about first part of January, and that's when we started bale grazing. Excuse me. And then this year in December, we were extremely cold and snowy, so I started bale grazing about the 20. This was one of the cool season pastures where I had set the bales up. When I moved the cattle in here, the bales were sitting there and they just spread out and went grazing. They'd sooner graze than eat hay. Again, how the animals get adapted. And then when I moved them out of this pasture, it was a real stormy day, and the fence line is right here. They're all crowded on the corner here. Open the gate, there's bales there for them. They just walked by them and started grazing. Before they were cold, huddled up in a corner, saw fresh grass out there, and they started grazing. So cattle are pretty tough. Anyway, people will say, well, when you bale graze, look at all the waste you got. Now you killed all that grass there. But this was the first 10-acre field that we bale grazed on. Get a little closer shot there. But what's unique about it, around the edge of the bale, sure you'll kill the grass there, but by fall, that's pretty much some annual weeds. By the next year, it's solid grass. But this was so dark green, again with the concentrate, all the dung and urine. Get a little ways away, you can see it's lighter colored. There's, at the very end of that, we hadn't bale grazed there. You can see how pale that grass looks. And then, so we did do some clippings. This was actually on Gabe's work at where he had bale grazed. So this was the concentrated area right beside the bit where the bale was, and this was right across the fence where he hadn't bale grazed. And this was some of mine. This year, this was on that clay pan. This was after we grazed it. We had the cattle in there about the 2nd of June, and that's how the regrowth was. You can hardly see the forward in there. Before the side hill, this gumbo clay pan stuff, that grass got, if it ever got to knee high, that would have been unusual. So there's another shot by the shelter, how lush that grass is. So you can easily, I figure you can easily double your production. Again, I think we got the clipping data here. But there's over 3 times the amount of production there beside the bale or with a non-bale grazing. Plus your nutrients are quite a bit higher. So if you, and I say conservatively, you've got a 20-foot circle where your bale was with very little production, and then easily you can double your production when you bale graze. So you can cut your costs down. The last 4 winters, I burned less than 2 tanks of fuel on my tractor. That's probably about 100 gallons, and that was also pushing the road out to get out to the highway. So I start a tractor once a week when I have to haul hay out. Like I say, this year I got 8 weeks supply set out there, so all I got to do is put down and open a gate. So you can make it very simple. So you can cut your fuel costs way down, easily double your grass production where you bale graze, and the health of the animals, like I say, they'd sooner be out there. I don't have to haul any manure anymore. Before we used to have them around the yard, you back around the calves, you have them locked up, have to haul manure out. You were up there every day feeding them. And another thing, when you're bale grazing, they know they got all this feed in front of them, and you get a storm, and they'll fill up. They probably don't eat for a day or so, and then they go back out when the storm's over and go graze, where in the past, when you fed them every day, what did you do? You fed in the morning was the most miserable, so you take them out, feed them, so you get them up, you create stress on them. Well, here they manage themselves. So you can make it very, very easy. Again, it's carbon, you're putting all that later on the soil surface, get that ground covered, and
Do you buy hay or do you bale it and grow it all yourself?
the question was if I buy hay or if I bale it. I still have some haying equipment, so the only way I can quit haying is if I sell the equipment I get. So I do buy some of my hay and I still put some up, but my goal is to base, because I need so very little hay. So on a wet year, you can buy hay very cheap. I don't use my barns anymore, so throw the hay in the barn. It's there when you need it. So that's my goal is basically, and what I heard today, that we shouldn't be haying around our fields or in the road ditches. So we leave some insectaries for the pollinators. So I'll probably have to quit haying too. It's all a balance, so we have to work with Mother Nature. We got so far away from that, so I think we just got to go back to a simple way of farming and let Mother Nature